All right, guys, in this video, I'm going to show you how to check your pushrod length. This is a pretty extensive part of an engine build, so I didn't want to include this in the rest of the videos because it would have just made that video way too long. So in this video, you're strictly just going to see how to check what length pushrods that you need to order so that you can move on with your build. Obviously, you're going to need your rocker arm studs that you're going to use. You're going to need the rocker arms that you want. Your lifters need to be installed, and you need your guide plates if you have non-self-lining rockers. So we're just going to install one or two of these rockers for one of the cylinders. We're going to check that one cylinder length. We might even check one, like 2 or 3 other cylinders just to make sure that the consistency is there. And then we can go ahead and place the order for our pushrod. So other than the valve train components you're going to be using, you'll need this pushrod length tester tool. Basically, it has this little line on here that you can see, and every time I make a full rotation with that line, you see it come back around. That's 50 thousandths of an inch. So we'll be able to check how long we need our pushrod. And then you're also going to need a solid lifter, or I took one of my old hydraulic lifters and put a tack weld in there. I know it's not pretty. I'm not a great welder, but this is going to be fine for what we're trying to do. We don't want that plunger to move because it's actually going to mess with our adjustment for how long the pushrod length should be, because if that pushes down in there, it's going to shorten the pushrod length. So I am going to be running a hydraulic lifter, so I need to account for that, but I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. There's lots of forums on the internet saying that you don't need to have a solid lifter like this, and you can set the preload and then check your length, but you're going to get a different reading that way. So I'll show you the right way to do it. One other alternative you can do other than welding a lifter like this or using a solid lifter is to get a lightened valve spring. You can actually replace one of these springs with a light one that you can squeeze just with your hands. Obviously that's a lot more work than just using one of these solid lifters or a welded lifter, because I don't want to take my heads back off or swap out springs or anything like that. It'd be a pain in the ass. So this is how I'm going to do it, and I'll show you guys how to do that right now. So go ahead and take a couple of your studs and a set of your guide plates. You don't have to torque these yet, just make sure that they're nice and snug. Now I'm taking my lifter that I've welded, or your solid lifter. I've cleaned it off very, very well. I don't want any like old metal or dirt or anything getting inside of there, so I cleaned it off, blew it out with air. Just gonna use this temporarily, set it down in our lifter bore there. This pushrod starts out at 6.8 inches, and we're going to start out with 7.1 inches. That's the pushrods I had in there last build. I'm hoping to be able to reuse those, and a lot of people with this build have commonly came up with 7.1 inch pushrods. So so starting from the very beginning, 6.8 to 6.85, 6.9, 9.5, 7 inches, 7.05, 7.1. So now we're at 7.1 inches. We're going to slide that down in the hole real slowly. Double check once it gets down in there that the lines are still lined up. Now we're going to color the tip of the valve with this black Sharpie. You can also use just like some Moly lube. And I'll show you why in a second here. This rocker arm is going to make a wear pattern on the top of this valve, so we'll be able to see where it's riding and see if it needs to be longer or shorter of a pushrod. So we're just going to set this on here. This rocker arm has like a little chamfered end in there, and then machined end. Make sure that the chamfered end is up, because if not, that chamfered end will actually grab onto the nut there, and it won't allow the rocker arm to move up properly on there. And that chamfered end is for the poly locking nuts. So those need to be facing up. Make sure that the pushrod sits properly in there. And then basically what we're looking for to find the right rocker arm geometry is that rocker arm should be as parallel with the top of this head as possible. We also want the tip of this rocker arm to sit in the very center of the valve as perfect as possible. And we want this pushrod here in the back of the rocker arm to be at a 90-degree angle as much as possible. So the less that angle is, the better. We don't want it like sitting at an extreme angle out like this, otherwise it's not going to have a lot of leverage. So the closer to 90 degrees on that rocker arm, the better. But what we're mostly going to go for is to make sure that that rocker arm is perfectly centered on the valve. Let's take one of your poly lock nuts, the Allen set screw in the middle there. They came out of the package screwed all the way down. You want to take them all the way out so that they're not interfering with how tight this rocker arm is. So now we're going to set this to 0 lash. It's not going to take any tools or anything to tighten this, because you're not going to tighten it at all. Zero lash, to be clear here, is not when the push rod can't spin anymore. It's when it can't move up and down anymore. So as you can see, there's a lot of vertical play there. I'm just going to run this down until that push rod has no more play. You can still spin the push rods at zero lash, but you can't move them up and down. So that's what you're really looking for. So now that we have this set to zero lash, we're going to rotate the engine over a couple times and give that rocker arm a chance to work. And basically it's going to wear a mark into the tip of that valve so we know if it's riding in the center or not. So the way that you'll be able to tell if this push rod is too long or too short is where the wear mark ends up on the tip of the valve. If it's further out to this side by my finger here, closer to the exhaust side, then the push rod is too long, because as you can see, if I push up on this push rod, see how it pushes that rocker arm toward the front of the valve? And then likewise, if you go back the other way, it will pull the rocker arm back on the valve. So you want to make sure that it's super centered on the tip of the valve there. All right, after giving it a chance to turn over a few times, you just remove the rocker arm. And we look at our wear pattern here, and it didn't wear very nicely as I thought it would. But if you can see that, you can see it wore directly in the middle of the valve. So just to double check that work, just in case like we got super lucky and thought that we were perfect the first try, I'm going to start by shortening the push rod 50,000 inch, so one turn. And if that is worse, then I'll try lengthening the push rod 50,000 inch from where it is now. I'll show you an example of what a too long of a push rod looks like. You can see how it's sort of toward the exhaust side of that valve there. That's too long, so we want to dial it down a little bit and make sure that it is in the center. Okay, now you just want to carefully remove your push rod and double check the length of it before you assume that you remember exactly where it was. So we're just going to count how many turns. We got 0.5 or 0.5, 0.1, 0.15, 0.2, and 0.25. So 6.8 plus 0.25 is 7.05. So that's the length that we finally ended up on. But since our lifter is welded, now you need to take into account, if you're running hydraulic lifters, that preload that you're going to set. So it depends on the threads that you have here and how much preload you're going to put on it. Some people like to only do a quarter turn of preload. Some people do a half of a turn. So depending on what you're going to set your preload to is going to change the length of the push rod. The more preload that you're going to push down into that lifter, the more length that you're going to need on your push rod. So here are the specs that you're going to need. So basically you take what your lifter preload is going to be and add that to the push rod length. So here's the math table. If you're running a 3/8 inch rocker stud, then your preload is going to be different because how coarse and how fine the threads are on the stud are going to change the distance that it's going to move that rocker arm. So for me, I'm running down there where you see the 7/16 inch rocker stud, and I'm going to do a half turn preload. So I'm going to add 0.025 to my measurement there. So I'm getting a final reading of 7.075. That's going to be my total measurement for my pushrod length. And since they don't make one that specific, unless I wanted to custom build one, I'm just going to round it up to 7.1. So the pushrod length that I'm going to need to order for this engine build is going to be 7.1.